If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People who drive at night, what's the strangest thing you've ever seen on rural roads, haunted forest roads, etc. A few years ago, while I was driving home from my night shift security job, it was about 6:20 a.m. during the summer, so it wasn't completely dark out. I was coming around a small curve in the highway, and I saw something. It looked like a naked human walking on all fours in that strange butt-up posture you make while bear crawling. It was moving slowly across the road with its head swaying back and forth as it crawled across the road in front of me. I was too confused to be scared, so I continued home. A day or two later, I was talking to my parents, who live about 2 miles from where I had seen that thing, and I told them about it. They told me some years before that 2 of their friends were walking in that area, and both came running to their house scared to death. They would never tell anyone what had happened or what they had seen. Later, while telling scary stories with my friends, I told them about the thing I had seen that night. One of my friends, who is a cop, said about 8 years ago a man was run over at that curve, and everyone in the community thought he was a skinwalker. It doesn't scare me. I still drive that same road all the time, day and night, but I still look for it every time I drive by that curve. I was driving with a group of friends home from a meeting for God knows what, I don't remember. I had recently discovered the Slenderman meme back when it was still pretty fresh and engaging, so I spent most of the trip explaining Slenderman to my friends. As it happens, the night we're driving, there's a full moon. There's a little bit of cloud cover for ambience, and we're in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Northwest. We're on a winding mountain road bordered by forest, i.e., perfect Slenderman territory. As a dumb teenage joke, every time we turn a corner, someone will point and yell Slenderman. This becomes a kind of race to see who can say it first. We turn a corner, everyone screams Slender. And then the car goes silent. We've turned onto a very long stretch of road. About 20 or 30 feet ahead of us is a tall man standing in the middle of the road. He's standing with his head dropped to the side, and he's kind of swaying. We slam on the brakes and sit there for a minute, watching him. He watches us. We're in the middle of nowhere. No homes, no visible cars. I don't know how this guy got here. After a minute, he slowly starts moving towards our car, so we take off. In the review mirror, we could see him just standing there, head dropped, swaying, watching us. I was driving alone from eastern Colorado to Wyoming in the middle of the night on a dirt road. It was the type of darkness that most people never get to experience. Like being in the middle of the ocean. There are no cities or even small towns for hundreds of miles in every direction. Once I hit the border of Wyoming, the road became pavement. After about half an hour, I hear this loud bang, and my car pulls hard into the middle of the road. I had a flat tire. I pull over and get out, and it's just as quiet as can be. So dark, not a single light of any kind for hundreds of miles except my dome and headlights. I start changing the tire by myself, feeling really uneasy about being alone in the middle of nowhere. So I get the tools and the spare out of the trunk and start changing the flat as fast as I can. For some reason, I'm trying to be quiet because it feels like dirt and sagebrush. I spin those lung nuts on, crank it tight, spin the jack down, and the whole time I have that feeling someone is right behind me. I threw all the tools in the trunk with the flat and could not jump back in my car fast enough. I felt like someone was going to stop me from closing the door when I slammed it shut. I sped home to Wyoming and freaked out the whole time. Checking my back seat over and over again. My cousin and I were driving home after a late night. We were both pretty tired and trying to stay awake. As we were driving along a dark road near home, we saw a little girl in a white night dress with no shoes walking along the street. When I saw her, I had to ask my cousin if he could see her. I've seen enough crazy movies with girls in them. He looked over and said, "What the hell?" Needless to say, we drove faster to get home and tried not to look back. When she saw the car driving past her, she tilted her head ever so slightly, looking in with a blank face. It was so calm, it was terrifying. I drove with my dad back home from my grandma's place, and the road you have to take is surrounded by woods, and there are barely any houses. There's a crossroad where the path splits into two. One continues to be asphalt, and another is gravel. Anyway, when we came close enough, we saw a black hooded figure standing on the side. She, or it was wearing a huge coat all the way to the ground and was facing away from us. I just drove past, shocked, and asked my dad if he saw it. He dismissed it and said I should keep driving, but he was clearly nervous. Not me, but my cousin shared a story that terrified me. There is a long and quite isolated road that connects 2 towns together. To the right is moorland that leads to the mountains, and to the left are farmers' fields. There are very few lights on this road, which makes it incredibly dark, and there are a number of fatalities every year. Due to the high traffic volumes associated with this road, it tends to be quiet during the evening, and few to no cars travel along it after dusk. My cousin works as a district nurse on the evening service, and this road is her quickest route home. She doesn't scare easily and is an experienced driver, so this road doesn't faze her. One night she was coming back along the road at about 11:30 p.m. and noticed a girl hunched over the side of the road. She thought it was odd, as pedestrians were never seen on this road, and there were no cars nearby that could have belonged to the girl. My cousin immediately pulled over, thinking the girl may need help. She got out of her car and started walking towards the girl. My cousin immediately regretted this and started to get a terrible feeling that she couldn't shake. She hesitated for a minute and stopped to take extra notice of the girl. She appeared to be wearing a very old-fashioned cloak and was hunched over, looking at the ground. As she got closer, the girl turned to look at her, and what she saw was terrifying. The girl had no facial features at all. There were no eyes, nose, or lips, and it was just a blank face staring at her. My cousin completely froze and felt sudden dread. She knew what she was seeing was not of this world. She quickly ran back to her car and locked all the doors. She then looked in her rearview mirror to see that the girl had completely disappeared. My cousin proceeded to drive quickly to the next town and called her office to explain what she had seen. A colleague was nearby and drove to the spot where the girl was seen, but he could find no trace of her. A few weeks later, another colleague witnessed the same thing but did not have time to get out of the car as the girl completely vanished in front of her eyes. My boyfriend is a truck driver. He goes from one end of the East Coast to the other. He had an overnight trip to Baltimore a few weeks ago and asked if I would like to ride along. I've never been any farther north than Virginia, so I was game. The trip went fine, nothing out of the ordinary happened. However, we were both pretty tired, having only slept fitfully for a couple of hours in a twin-sized sleeper in the semi. Anyway, we were maybe 45 minutes away from home on our way back at a stoplight. I looked to my right, and clear as day, I saw a black dog with a white spot on its chest walking out into traffic. The light had just turned green, so everyone was taking off again. It was so real to me that I began impulsively hitting the brakes on the passenger side. I was waiting for the dog to come out from under the car next to us injured, but I never saw it. By this time, my stomping on the imaginary brakes had caught the attention of my boyfriend. When I told him about what I had seen, he kind of giggled. Apparently, seeing a black dog walk into traffic is a pretty common side effect of staring at the road for so long. It makes sense, I suppose, but it looked so very real. Like I said, I gasped and was all shite for a minute. My mind has never played tricks on me before, so it's still a little unsettling that I could see something imaginary so vividly. Not that creepy, I know, but you had to be there, I guess. This was creepy to me at the time. My aunts and I were on a road trip to visit my grandparents. We were driving almost 3,000 miles to the Northwest Territories of Canada from Portland, Oregon. Most of the drive is on long, lonely highways. I decided it would be a good idea to bring along an unsolved mysteries book to pass the time. Because reading about murder is always good road trip fun. We stop at a campground and just sleep in the van. I was sleeping in the front passenger seat. I thought I heard footsteps close to the van but didn't see anything. When I woke up the next morning, I glanced out the window, and there was a full face print on the window. Like someone had been watching us during the night. Needless to say, I didn't sleep for the rest of the drive. I was driving through southern Oregon overnight to make a load on time. I'm not really a night runner, so I was dead ducking tired, and I mainly blame it on that. My ex-girlfriend was in the front seat, hanging out and keeping me awake. She wasn't saying shit, probably playing on her phone. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a pale-ass face ducking doing some nana boo boo kid mocking me shit, and I thought it was her. So I ask her, "Did you just get right up in my face and wiggle your head around?" And she's all like, "No, I've been sitting here the whole time." I think it was because I was tired, but Oregon is a big-time native territory, so I don't know. I was driving for Trans Am Trucking one morning in the summer of 2015, and while heading west on I-72 and just west of Forsyth, Illinois, 3 sister tornadoes formed probably 1,000 yards to the south of my travel lane. Talk about a major pucker factor. I was empty too, so I was even more nervous. I kept watching them, but they were moving almost due west and not getting any closer to I-72. Fuck me, but that was some scary ass shit. Then another time, at night, while I was with my trainer and working for US Express, I was at a railroad crossing. I stopped the proper 15 to 50 feet from the crossing. I opened my windows, checked, and listened for a sign of a train. There was no indication of a train coming, the crossing arms were up, and my trainer was in the right seat checking as well. Just as my steer tires reached the first rail, a very loud train horn sounded. We both jumped out of our skins, and I mashed the throttle with my foot. Both of us were frantically looking for a train, but we couldn't see any lights in either direction. I almost killed myself. I saw a black dog once. It's an old trucker's legend, you can Google it for more info. But anyway, the legend is that lots of truck drivers have wrecked because, they claimed, a black dog had run right out in front of them. Well, when I saw it, it definitely looked like a dog. You could see the legs running and alternating in the same pattern as a real dog. It disappeared when I was about 20 yards away from it. Within a few seconds, I realized that it was caused by the lights of the oncoming traffic shining through the guardrail. But I could definitely see how a driver could think it was real, especially if you were sleepy. Back around 2004 to 2005, I was leaving a buddy's house and headed home. He lived on Lake Ariel, in Wayne County. I was a good 15 miles away, so I decided to take back roads to save time and avoid cops. As I crest this mountain road, I see a van off to the side, doors open, lights on. It's well after midnight, and no one is on the road. I slowed my car, a 1989 VW ragtop, down to first gear, looking for a person or persons that may be hurt. Not a soul is around, and the woods are quiet. The van off the road is not running, but all lights are on, and the driver's door is open. I remember thinking, shit, I don't have cell service until the top of the mountain, I've got to call the cops. So I proceeded to go where I knew I had cell service. Maybe going 30 miles per hour, tops. I knew this situation was ducky, but then it got worse. No more than 3 or so miles away, the brush thinned on the roadside, so you had a better view of what was in the woods. I see movement, so I let off the gas, thinking I don't want to pass a deer. As I let off, this man, soaking in fresh blood, comes from the tree line and into the road. He's so covered in gore that I couldn't tell it was a man at first. He stumbled out in front of the car and waved me down. I was in my ragtop, top down, of course. He was yelling and grabbing at my door. I dropped in first and took off. Another mile or so later, I had cell service and called the cops. Dude was obviously hurt, and his grab for my door scared me. There was a wide space on the mountain where I agreed to wait for the cops. They were there in under 10 minutes. While I waited, I put the top up and then locked the doors. An officer took my statement, and he looked over my car with a torch. The guy from the woods left a bloody smear on my door. Another officer found the van but couldn't locate the guy who came out of the woods. The cops let me go home and said they'd call if they needed anything further. Within a few days, I did get a call saying the van was located, and they asked if I could describe the man. They never found him that night, and as far as I know, they never did. We saw ourselves drive past, and I still can't explain how. We passed the exact same car going up a rural mountain road in the middle of the night. It was a very distinct vehicle, so the chances of us being mistaken were much lower, even in the dark. It was a 1985 Dodge Omni with aftermarket spokes on the hubcaps, and one of the doors was a different color than the rest of the car. It was too dark to make out the details of the people in the car, except that there were 2 of them. We turned around as quickly as we could and raced back up the mountain to try to catch up to the other car, but since it was such a narrow, winding road, turning around was difficult, and we never found them. We both think it was actually us from some alternate reality or timeline that we accidentally crossed over into. Well, it started when my friend destroyed his Jeep while driving through a ditch. We were off-roading with a few guys, and this dude did some stupid shit. Well, he had to get his Jeep towed, and the other guy we were with decided he would stay behind with him and let one of us take his Jeep home. We're on our way back in his Jeep at around 2 in the morning. We're doing around 50 or 60 miles per hour. Suddenly his Jeep starts shaking violently, and after about 15 minutes of trial and error, we figure out that the only way to prevent that is to constantly change speeds. We would alternate going between 15 and 55 miles per hour. While we're in this 15-minute trial and error period, a few terrifying things happen. We're in the middle of Alabama at 2 a.m. We give the owner a call and ask what the duck is wrong. He said it's a normal occurrence after off-roading, and he's sorry he didn't tell us. Okay, whatever. After about 5 minutes after the call, a ducking huge pack of wild dogs came running straight up to the side of the Jeep. There were about 20 dogs, all barking and jumping at us. We sped up and drove away immediately. We eventually hit an area with some houses and a church. I looked to my right, and behind the church is a giant burning cross. I turned everyone's attention towards it and told them to drive away right now. I was terrified. We drove the rest of the way home without incident. Needless to say, I probably won't be going back to Alabama. My friends and I were driving back from a rave in Denver. We take 287 from Fort Collins to Laramie because it is the quickest way home. 287 is a beautiful drive during the day but empty and sketchy at night, especially during the winter. Wyoming. I was in the back seat, and inebriated, so I missed this, but I asked my friend who was in the passenger seat to tell me the story again. Punctuation and etc. were added for clarity. Owl Canyon is a little 2-lane detour that I think might have even been unpaved at the time. Car on the side of the road just after the Owl Canyon, so rocky as cliffs. Pitch black on either side of the road. The dude is just chilling in the middle of the road in all black, trying to wave us down. We don't see him till maybe 20 to 30 feet and have to swerve hard to miss him. I don't know why he wanted us to stop, but I don't think it was good. This would have been around 3 a.m. probably, and like I said, it would be empty out there at that hour, so this is weird. The helper in me is like, maybe he was in trouble, but I'm glad my friends have some street smarts, because if he had bad intentions or some kind of weapon, we would have been ducked. We were all pretty young at the time, too. So this is a story my dad recently told me about my grandpa, his dad, and my great-grandpa. My grandpa grew up in very rural southern Indiana but moved to very rural southern Illinois in his youth, so this takes place in Illinois. One night, Grandpa and his dad were hanging out at his uncle's house, who lived a couple of miles away. Keep in mind that this is the 40s out in the country, so all roads are just dirt, basically. Anyway, it was pretty late, so they decided to head home and hopped into their old car, going probably about 15 miles per hour through these wooded roads. At some point, as they're just driving and talking, they passed something along the edge of the road, standing upright. They both hunted and were very familiar with any animals or other local people that may be around. Neither one of them really said anything for a minute, and then they both looked at each other and said, "What the hell was that?" My grandpa asked his dad, "Do you want to turn around?" And he said, "Nope." And they kept driving. My grandpa said it resembled a big owl or a small person just standing in the ditch. I was the manager of a very well-known drugstore and took a back road to the store back and forth every day for 2 years. It was semi-rural, as it had once been acres of farmland that was now being sold off to developers. Just for some insight into the area. My ex-in-laws lived in this area for 30 years, on 200 acres, and had a cattle farm. They still lived nearby, just on a smaller farm, so this was a very frequented area to drive for my family, and my ex knew the area very well. This was a heavily mined area where a lot of strange things happened. There was also a huge landfill in the area. I was coming home one day, Julyish, not too tired, and was looking across the cornfields when, as I came around a bend, I noticed a house on the edge of the fields I had never noticed before. It was a very unassuming red house, small, with a peak roof and a porch in front. My first thought was not, "Wow, I've never seen that house before," but how in the heck do the people get into it? There are no driveways leading to it. Weirdly, this is 2015, and there has to be a driveway. As I continued and rounded another bend, I couldn't see the house anymore, but I was looking at a few houses nearby to see if their driveways went back to this house and couldn't see any way into it. By then there was a very well-traveled intersection and a huge church, so I just sort of kept alert and rove. Later in the evening, I told my ex about this house and that it felt very weird. In all the time I had driven that road, I had never noticed it. I went to work the next day, and when I came home, the only way I would have seen it was that it wasn't there. I don't know what I saw that day, but I can still see that house very clearly in my head. Back in the late 1980s, I was in the Ohio National Guard. We were having our annual training at Camp Grayling, Michigan, and were involved in a long vehicle movement. At the time, we drove M113 armored personnel carriers, and I was the driver of one of them. We had been driving for close to 15 hours, with dinner breaks, with no sleep when I turned my head to the left and saw an Indian in full regalia and headdress riding a horse next to our column. What's funny is that I was so tired that I didn't freak out but just smiled. He rode next to me for about a minute and then rode into the woods. I was driving at about 1 to 2 a.m., coming home from a board game night at a friend's place that had run really late. They lived in a rural area, so it was a long and lonely drive home. I was alone in my car. There were 3 odd things that happened in quick succession. The first is that I drove into a very heavy bank of fog. The fog wasn't even that uncommon in the area, but only in the mornings and never after midnight. This area wasn't close to the ocean or something, and there was no wind, so it couldn't have been blown from somewhere else. Weird, but not unexplainable or scary. I reduced my speed so the car was only doing 40 or so, and I continued on. Eventually, I drove out of it. The second was that I came upon a huge tree that was on fire. Completely engulfed, it had to be at least 3 stories tall. It was a fair way from the road, and there was nobody I could see around it. Sometimes people burn out old trees, but why would they do it at 2 a.m.? There had been no storm, so it couldn't have been a lightning strike. The weirdest thing about it was that it felt strange looking at it. Like it was some kind of portent or omen. I'm not a religious or superstitious person, but looking at this tree, I can't even explain the feeling. Like something important was happening or coming. But I drove. Then I came upon a section of the road that was undergoing maintenance. It's not unusual to see crews working on roads at all hours of the night. But in this case, there was no crew. I slowed down and stopped because there was a sign up saying to wait for directions. There were half a dozen trucks with lights flashing. Windows down. One of those small bobcat things with a scoop on the front like a miniature bulldozer. There was even a radio playing somewhere, though I couldn't see it. The scene is burned into my brain 5 years later. The song American Pie was playing on the radio. And suddenly I was afraid. I was more afraid than I had ever been before or since. I have been bitten by a deadly snake miles from help, had a gun pointed at me by a schizophrenic, and seen my sister nearly fall off a cliff. But never in my life have I been as afraid as I was in that moment. It was like I was actually having trouble catching my breath. It was flat in every direction. Even if these dozens of men had decided to hide as some sort of prank, there was nowhere for them to go. Then suddenly the song kind of skipped on the lyrics, the jester stole his thorny crown. Except it wasn't like the same section of the song was just playing again. It was more like time was skipping. I don't even know how to explain this. I suddenly realized that something terrible was about to happen to me. Probably the same thing that had happened to the road crew. So I punched the gas. Foot straight to the floor. For 2 long seconds, nothing happened. The car didn't even move despite being in drive with the engine running. Then suddenly the acceleration started, and I was pushed back in my seat, almost sideswiping some of the trucks. I drove at an unsafe speed for about another 15 minutes, and the feeling of danger was gone. Then I pulled over and cried my eyes out. I was actually obsessed with it for years afterwards. The weather reports didn't record any fog. I drove the route a week later in daylight, looking for the charred remains of the tree, but could never find anything. Even if it had burned to the ground, there still should have been a patch of dead grass. I called up the Department of Main Roads and asked them how long the work on that particular stretch of road would be continuing, only to have them tell me that the last maintenance they had done on that area was 7 years ago and not in the section I described. When I went back to look for the tree, I could see no evidence of any fresh repairs. In fact, there were several potholes, and that is usually the first thing fixed. I actually ended up going to see a psychiatrist about it. I was worried I had experienced some kind of adult-onset mental illness. He couldn't seem to find anything wrong with me. So I never got any answers. This happened when I was trying to make the 19-hour drive from Connecticut to Florida without stopping to sleep. I was on I-95 South just after midnight somewhere in South Carolina, and I was about 100 miles away from running out of gas. I saw a sign that said there was a gas station at the next exit, so I got off. The exit ramp turned into a 4-way intersection. You could turn left or right, or if you went straight, you could get right back on the highway. I pulled up to the end of the ramp, looked to the right, and there was the gas station. I started heading in that direction, but then I saw something that made me slam on my brakes. I looked at this gas station, and I suddenly saw 6 people, dressed in white shirts and white pants, dancing around the parking lot. It creeped me out. I didn't think there was anything supernatural about it at the time, but it was really odd that a group of people were dancing in an empty gas station parking lot around midnight. I didn't hear any music, but all 6 of them were moving like they were in a big mosh pit. Then one of them noticed me. He had been dancing very fluidly right at the front of the gas station, but all of a sudden he stopped, looked right at me for a few seconds, and started walking toward at night again. While I was driving a business van, someone in front of me stopped for a pee in a forest. While he was away, a man with an axe entered his car and sat in the back seat. I started to follow that car. After about 30 kilometers of following him through the middle of nowhere, he drove into a gas station and called the police. I was still behind him. The cops came to interrogate me because I was following him through weird rural roads. I said that some suspicious man with an axe sneaked into his car in a forest. Then the cops went into his car, and a few seconds later, they went out with an axe. The man was gone, but there were fingerprints that apparently matched some other mysterious murder case in that forest. I had a serious row with my company because my GPS showed that I was far away from where I was supposed to be. They didn't fire me, but I had a feeling that they were mobbing me, so I just made sure to abuse the business stuff, fuel, car, and phone, as much as possible, and then I left when I was offered another job. In the early 1980s, my brother, Steve, age 16, went to northern Missouri, flatland, with his best friend, Mike, to visit his relatives who were farmers. We grew up to be rather independent. Driving a car by age 12 was the status quo among country kids, so aside from being required to go to church, we were pretty much allowed to do what we wanted, and it sounds like it was no different for them there. They had a lot of fun goofing around and had great stories of what they did, but one story sticks out in my mind. Late one night they were in my brother's old hot rod Mustang driving down the long, straight, and narrow dirt roads of farm country. We live in the Rocky Hills, when the road became a very tight one-lane road with the fence lines so overgrown with trees they were a canopy over the road. It can be odd to see overgrown roads in that area because fertile, flat land is a precious commodity. He said they were creeping along because they didn't want to run into a dead end with a fence and tear the car up. Headlights were definitely not the same as now, and something just seemed funky. Along the lane, they passed a driveway with a chained-up wire hog panel as a gate. In the moonlight, they could see an old two-story farmhouse that had collapsed in on itself, with the traditional big barn beside it looking like it was going to do the same at any time. There wasn't a pole light that most people kept around, only the moonlight. They continued on as the road seemed to get even more overgrown, talking about whether they should just attempt to back up the half-mile to the farm's driveway and turn around. Finally, they could see ahead that the road opened up to some sort of clearing, and as they pulled into it, the road suddenly ended at an old iron gate with a makeshift sign reading Coon Cemetery. They were at a graveyard. By this time, they had spooked themselves out. They were somewhat lost and had just creeped down some overgrown road to end up at a graveyard in the middle of the night. Steve managed to turn the car around and head back, going a little more quickly than before. As they started nearing the driveway to the rundown farm, they could just make out something very tall and glowing white in the driveway of the old place. As the headlights hit the driveway and the apparition, they realized it was a ghostly white, giant old man, around 6 feet 4 inches, standing by the side of the road, wearing only pants and no shoes, just calmly waving at them. Still, nary a light but the moon. They hightailed it out of there, and they both could have cared less if he scratched his car or not. He told us that over 30 years ago, and I've never forgotten it. My encounter happened in February of 2007. I used to work the third shift at a paper stock factory warehouse. The main day shift supervisor was on vacation, so our boss on night shift decided she wanted to leave early, so she let us sneak off about 2 hours earlier than our normal shift end time. So this would have been between 4:30 and 5 a.m. I was following a coworker down this county road, as the warehouse was on the outskirts of my small rural town. I noticed he hit his brakes and proceeded to swerve off the road. I'm probably 1,000 behind him, and I'm thinking to myself, what the heck is this dude doing? And that's when I saw it. There was a tall, dark figure strolling down the middle of the road, hunched over and swaying from side to side. I have likened it to how one of those tall blower figures you see swaying at a car dealership or something like that moves. Very unnatural movements. I can't do it justice by describing it, as it would only really make sense if someone saw it themselves. It looked like a tall person wrapped in a large, dark blanket or cloak. I had to hit the brakes and swerve too, but I came to a full stop. Whatever it was, I couldn't make out any features or characteristics. I saw a large torso with 2 legs. The upper half was hunched forward as if it were leaning like an older person would with a walker. At that time, I was driving a 1998 Ford Explorer, and I looked up the height of the vehicle, and it lists it as around 67, but whatever walked past my driver's window was a good foot or more higher than that, leaning forward. So whatever was walking had to be at least 7 feet tall. Again, I could not see a head or any arms, just a figure with legs walking. My taillights illuminated it as I started to drive past it. I couldn't make out any definite details about the body. I didn't see fur, skin, or anything like clothing. It was solid, not translucent. It was just large, thick, and black, or at the very least dark gray in color. My coworker had pulled over into a parking lot a little ways down the road, and I followed him in, and you could tell he was scared. He was saying something along the lines of, "What was that? It didn't have a head," is among a lot of other things panicked people say. We decided to drive back down and try to see if it was still there and what it actually was. I drove in front, and he was following behind. We come up to the general area, and I noticed there's a large black animal lying in the middle of the road. It appeared to be a big black dog. Part of me knew this wasn't large enough to be what was walking in the road, but we had to stop because it was directly in the middle of the roadway. I decided to get out and walk up to it, all the while my coworker was yelling at me to get back in my vehicle. As I approach whatever is lying in the road, it brings its head up and looks back at me. Its eyes are glowing yellow, which I write off as I shine from the headlights, but it growls at me. So I stop dead in my tracks and just watch. This thing stands up on its back legs like a person but falls back down. It sits back up and hobbles off to the side of the road like a wounded animal that wasn't able to use its front legs. It looked like your typical German shepherd or wolf, but its fur was puffy like a chow dog. It was a lot bigger than most dogs, but still nowhere near as tall as whatever was walking down the road. I didn't see any blood or wounds, so I can't say if it actually hurt or not. My coworker got out of the car at this point after it had disappeared into the woods. We discussed what the heck just happened, but while we were talking, I noticed next to our feet was a mouse. It was just standing there with us, but it was cleaning itself. I nudged it with my shoe, and it just kept cleaning its face as if it weren't afraid of us. The mouse was sitting in an upright position, as in on its hind legs, and using its front paws to wipe itself. I never really considered until recently that all three of these bizarre happenings were all on two legs. We got back in our vehicles and drove off, and then the next time at work, I mentioned what happened, and our coworkers laughed at us, so the other guy who saw it told me if I don't stop talking about it, he's just going to deny it, and I'd better just forget about it. A couple of months ago, my ex was driving down the road in Fairview, North Carolina. It was dusk, and the sun was setting that beautiful, warm red that it does in these parts. Something related to intuition kicked in, and she looked towards the highway barrier on the opposite side of the road. What she witnessed was a faceless, pale, mannequin-type entity hunched over the barrier. It had no discernible face but did have arms, a torso, and legs. Pretty freaked out, she continued on and picked me up from work. When we drove back through, about 15 minutes later, the entity was gone. This isn't an area where people would set up pranks, let alone set up a prank and remove it in less than 20 minutes. Whatever she saw, it freaked her out pretty good. My buddy and I heard of phantom headlights and cars that would suddenly appear and then not be there the moment you looked again. We were driving on a straight part of the road on level ground, about to come up on one of the first main hills, past all the telephone poles and lights, pitch black, when we saw something start to glow on the horizon. It was raining, so if it was a car with its high beams, it would have definitely illuminated the sky, but as we drove up the first hill, we noticed that there was only one singular light, and it was so bright that it literally could have been the sunset if it wasn't 12 a.m. Anyways, it's midnight, raining, on a random road in the middle of Sacramento, so the idea that maybe it was just a motorcycle was out of the question because who would drive a motorcycle that late, randomly, in the rain? Then we noticed just how bright it actually was and how there was something else that was odd. It wasn't moving. It didn't get closer to us, and it almost appeared to be in the middle of the road. So within a full 30 to 45 seconds of seeing this thing, it didn't move, get brighter, or get bigger, even though we were flooring it down the road to get a glimpse of it. Then, while we are still on the hill, we climb up towards it. Poof. The light just turns off. But it wasn't instant. It was like turning off a fluorescent light bulb or dimming a lamp. It made the hair on our back stand up because, as far as we knew, we just experienced one of these phantom headlights that there are stories of. This particular incident occurred on a very dull night in the middle of summer. We were all in the 18 to 19 age range. Since it was such a small town, there was hardly anything to do. Most of us were unemployed and had no early morning obligations, so naturally, this turned into all-night misadventures. Two of us, me being one, were notorious adrenaline junkies. If any of you live in a small town, you know how utterly dull it can be, especially for younger people, which turns into all forms of juvenile entertainment for a desperate need for stimulation. Our idea for stimulation that night was to steal some road signs. It was a thing we did somewhat often when all other ideas failed to suffice. We usually targeted only interesting ones around the county. By this point, we had gotten them all, so we decided to go a county over. In the friend group, there were 5 of us. One happened to have their mom's GPS system, and we found one sign that I absolutely had to have, Loveless Lane. And off we went. I don't remember what time it was, but it definitely had to be past 11 p.m., most likely later, as we didn't want to risk anyone being awake while we broke the signs off the posts. This particular road sign was on a dead-end backcountry road. On the way in, we spotted a tractor crossing sign. My best friend, Kay, was thrilled and thought it hilarious, so we all decided to steal it on the way out. Now this specific sign was metal and not the usual fiberglass that is used for road names, so we couldn't simply snap it off. We'd have to either pull the whole post out of the ground and wrench it off or use tools. This sign was directly across from a gravel driveway. This comes into play later. We never felt any unease going down the road, but we all acknowledged we were very much in the middle of ducking nowhere, and it was, of course, extremely dark. The only thing of note was the sheer amount of wildlife out on the roads. Several opossums, raccoons, a coyote, and a few deer. All are very common to see, but not usually on the same trip or road. I made a joke about how it was like a safari drive. We get our Loveless Lane sign, and we head back out. We came up with a game plan to steal the tractor crossing sign. S was driving, and I was in the passenger seat. K was in the back behind me, and Girl 1 and Girl 2 were the other passengers in the back. When we got closer to the sign, S didn't want to risk getting hit in the road, so we opted to kill the headlights and pull into the gravel driveway. S then covered the interior lights with their hat to avoid any risk of being seen. K and I were supposed to jump out quickly, run across the road, and get to work on the sign while the others kept a lookout. K and I had our doors ajar when Girl 1 went, "What's that?" in a confused tone. K and I whip our heads forward, and we see this looming silhouette, maybe 12-ish feet from the front of the car. It's dark, and we're still of the mind that we're going to steal this sign, but we also don't want to get shot at or in trouble. We all stare at it. It doesn't move. Relevant information here: K is terrified of dogs at this point in their lives. The silhouette is probably around 10 feet tall. Pointed ears. Think Great Dane, that's exactly what the silhouette looked like. Girl 2, is it a scarecrow? Me, I don't know. I didn't notice it when we came in. Girl 1, is it a horse? Me, it kind of looks like a dog, actually. Duck, no, I'm not getting out if it's a dog. Me, let's just get the sign real quick and go. There aren't any dogs that tall. Duck, you, I'm not getting out. Me, it isn't even moving. And then it cocked its head to the side. Had I been the driver, I would have turned the headlights on, at least to know what it was. But at that point, everyone freaked out. S slammed the car in reverse and peeled out of there as fast as they could. I think about that night on and off, and, going by logic, I've assumed it was something like a llama, which isn't that uncommon for the area, but llamas don't get 10 feet tall. Another theory was a horse, but it wasn't nearly wide enough, possibly emaciated. But there was no indication of a mane in the silhouette, and the head cocked to the side offered no indication of a long snout that you'd think you'd notice if it were an equine-type animal. I'm still not sure what it was. This legend has been around for decades, and the locals have no idea where it came from. In a time dating at least to the early 1990s, on an old dirt road connecting 2 points of a geographically large town, there is a story passed down from teen to teen and family member to family member. Folly Road, a 5-mile stretch of dirt road with a small pond, but a step from the road about halfway between the 2 points, lives a very eerie tale. There are no street lights, and few homes are far and in between the desolate road. There are several runoffs, of which many do not enter. The narrow road is surrounded by thick Maine woodland. As the story goes, a young woman was walking the road by herself one summer evening. As darkness began to fall on the quiet Maine woods, she began to get nervous. Luckily for her, a truck with 2 men was driving down the road, raising hell. Their headlights provided much needed light, comforting her, but only momentarily. The men whizzed by, noticing her. Much to her misfortune. They stopped only yards from her and kicked the truck in reverse. The driver leaned out of the window and offered a ride. Reluctantly, the young woman agreed to a ride, not knowing what this would entail. The men almost immediately took advantage of her and drowned her in the nearby Pearly Pond. Nobody knows the exact date and time this took place, but as the legend goes, on the anniversary of that night every year, if you're driving down that road, a series of unexplainable events will take place. First, whatever vehicle you are driving will shut down unexpectedly. If you check your rear view or side mirrors, you will see a soaking wet young woman approach the vehicle on the driver's side. Her skin was waterlogged. Her hair, covering her face. She will ask for a ride to the end of the road. If you deny her a ride, she will curse you and haunt you for the remainder of your days. Me and my best friend in college went from Alabama to Atlanta, Georgia, a bunch of times to shop, go to Six Flags, eat, or whatever, but one time we were coming back super late, after midnight. Once you're past noon in Georgia, on I-85 going towards Alabama, there is a good stretch of nothing, but we got hungry and got off because the interstate sign said there was a Wendy's. We turned left as the sign said and went across the bridge. We didn't see a Wendy's but kept driving. We were nearly 20 minutes down the road talking when we realized there was no restaurant. The road we were on bent to the right and had a T intersection stop sign. There was another interstate sign saying I-85 to the right. We said okay and turned right, saying that we would just go back to the interstate and go up to another exit to find food. About 5 minutes down the road, though, there was an empty gas station and Wendy's, and it was open. We thought, okay, that was a way to get there from the interstate 25 minutes ago, but whatever. We also needed gas, so we went there first. Another vehicle pulls up at the pump across from us, and the old guy gets out, freezes, and stares silently like a horror movie at me pumping gas. He left before me, which seemed quick. My soul shivered, but I finished, and we went into the Wendy's drive-thru. The server at the speaker and window sounded like a tired robot and also stared at us blankly like a zombie without blinking. We waited, got our food, and couldn't wait to leave. Just before driving off, I look at the gas station again, and the same creepy man is there, in the same spot, staring at us in the Wendy's line, completely silent and still. We turned right quickly on that same road, going in the same direction towards where it said the interstate would be. We seemed to drive longer than we thought without the interstate popping up, so we decided to just turn around and retrace our drive. We went back the opposite direction looking for Wendy's so that we knew how far the left turn would be, but before you know it, there the left turn was, no gas station, no Wendy's. We turned left anyway and went back to the interstate just like we came and ate our ghost Wendy's in silence halfway home before having the gumption to ask each other if that just happened. I live in a very rural area in the Midwestern part of the United States. About 20 minutes away from the nearest town and about 6 minutes from the nearest township. For those of you who have lived in the sticks, you know as well as I do that creepy sounds and sightings that make you second guess what you saw are commonplace if you spend any amount of time outdoors at night. It was 3:30 on a Saturday morning. I was driving home alone from a party. On a small, lightless country road leading out of the nearest township to my house, there are two cemeteries. The old cemetery and the one that they still actively plant people in these cemeteries are on either side of the road and are about 200 feet from each other, or roughly 61 meters. I had just passed the second cemetery and taken a curve into a part of the forest that was especially dense. No moonlight penetrated the canopy of the trees that reached across the road. I slowed down in case a deer decided to jump out in front of me, as was frequent in that area. That's when I saw it. There was a large, dark mass in the middle of the road. At first, I thought perhaps it was a limb or a dog of some sort, but as my headlights illuminated the creature, I knew all too well that this was abnormal at best. There, standing in the road, was a large black bird. The size of a vulture or eagle, however, it had no head. Now, as an educated hillbilly, I know fully well that when a bird roosts, it tucks its head under its wings in many cases, and that could fully explain this. That is what logic and reason would tell you. Although I have never known a bird to roost on the ground, let alone in the middle of a road. I stopped my Jeep about 10 yards, 9-ish meters, from the bird with my headlights illuminating it. I sat and pondered the situation for a moment, honking to see if it would startle the bird into flying away. It did not stir. I sat for a moment longer, and this horrible sense of dread filled my soul. I then decided to drive carefully around the sleeping bird. I stopped, rolled down my window, and shined a light down on it to get a better look up close. Instead of finding a tucked head, I looked down the bloody gullet of a decapitated specimen. From there, I must admit my terror was real, and I made haste in leaving this unsavory omen behind. The next morning, the bird was gone without a trace. So in June of 2021, I was leaving a friend's house that was about 2 hours from my house, and it was about 5 p.m. I would visit this friend pretty often, and my mom would expect me home at around 8 to 10 p.m. because usually I would stop and get food. This particular evening was like any other, and I just said goodbye to my friend, hopped in my car, and began my 2-hour drive back home. The way I take back home is mostly back roads, so it's not a super busy road. About 45 minutes into my drive, however, I felt really odd. Like something was wrong or like there was a sense of doom inside me. I was looking around me on the road and kept checking my rear view, and I saw nothing out of the ordinary. So I locked eyes with the road in front of me, and that's when everything went silent. I could move my body, and the noises of my car and my music just stopped. I tried to snap out of this trance, but I couldn't do anything. Then, all of a sudden, everything came back. The car, the music, even the slight noises from outside. I looked around in a panic, and it took me a minute to realize that it was now dark. When I left my friends, there were still a good 2 hours of daylight. How the hell is it dark already? I kept driving until I stopped at the gas station, which marked the 1-hour mark of my drive. When I checked the time on my phone, it was 11 p.m. I nearly threw up when I realized that what I thought was a 45-minute drive was actually 6 ducking hours. The first thing I did was go into the gas station, grab a drink, and call my mom. She picked me up in a frenzy, asking if I was okay and crying. She then told me the news that she called set in a forest, so my paranoia was already alarmed. A year into living in Iowa, our dog was getting really old, so we got another dog so our old dog had a friend. We named our new dog Tucker, and he is a very energetic dog with everyone and everything. Our old dog died a couple of months later, and Tucker was the only interactive pet we had. A couple of years later, my mom and dad got divorced, and she moved on to a guy who lives a couple of miles from our house. My mom and dad settled on a schedule for when they can spend the day with us, while the other goes somewhere else for a couple of days. For context, my mom's side is native, I forgot what tribe we are, and we do believe in the lore of skinwalkers and Wendigos. On one of my mom's days, she drives up this road, which is surrounded by a bunch of trees, a couple of houses, and 2 farms. There is a hill on this road that she has to drive up, and as my mom drove up the hill, she saw something in a field near the neighborhood. What she saw was tall, gray-skinned, had deer hooves as feet, and it was walking into the woods. My mom was confused, and when she reached a stop sign, she looked back in her mirror and saw nothing. Now my mom was scared because she remembered all the stories of the Wendigo and drove off to our house. When she told me this, I was already scared because of the stories I'd heard on YouTube. As she told the story, I remembered the skinwalker, mostly all the stories of the encounters I found on YouTube. After this, I was extremely cautious when I was outside on my bike rides. Without thinking, I rode my bike near the hill where my mom saw the possible Wendigo. I brought my camera to take pictures of the landscape because it was nice out, but my paranoia was going off when I was near the field, and I always trust my paranoia. As I rode off, I felt like I was being watched as I rode past the field. A couple of days later, it was nighttime, and my dog had to go outside to go to the bathroom. I put my dog on a leash that is connected to the porch and let Tucker out. I turned on a light that was outside so I could see what Tucker was doing, but I was cooking food in the kitchen for myself, so I had to focus on that. When my food was finished, I heard my dog start barking at something, so I walked towards the door so I could see what he was doing. Tucker is barking at something in the dark. I opened the door and told Tucker to stop barking and get inside, because his business was done and his barking could wake up the neighbors. After telling him to get inside, he kept barking at something in the darkness. My paranoia kicked in, and I shouted out for him to get inside, but he kept barking. I started to get scared, and I finally looked into the darkness to see nothing but eyes shining from the porch light. As I saw those eyes, an instinct kicked in to pull on the leash and scream out, "Get inside." Finally, Tucker responds by reacting to the pull of the leash and running towards the door, and I slam the door as soon as Tucker runs inside. I shut the porch light off, took the leash off his collar, locked every single door and window in the house, and covered every window and anything that you could look through. After Tucker was off the leash, he ran downstairs into our basement, so I grabbed my food and went downstairs to keep an eye on my dog. It's been 2 months since then, and my routine when it got dark was what I did when I saw those eyes outside, like close the blinds, lock the doors, and turn off the lights from outside. Now when I'm outside, I need a group of people or a weapon on me. When I was 13 to 14, me and my friends would sneak out and go hang out with our boyfriends out in the middle of nowhere. We lived basically in the middle of nowhere, so going to random backroads was pretty much our only option for having fun. We would go to this place that the locals called the tunnel. It was just a dirt road with tall trees and overgrown willows on both sides. It was very secluded, so we would go there to drink beer, smoke weed, and make out with our boyfriends. One night, around 1 or 2 in the morning, we were sitting in our friend's car in the tunnel. We had all been drinking and smoking weed. We were all joking and laughing when suddenly the driver whispered, "What is that up there?" I looked and didn't see anything, so I replied, "There's nothing up there, your eyes are playing tricks on you." "No, seriously, there's something in the road up there," he replies. The guy sitting in the passenger seat agrees and says he sees something too. The driver puts the car in drive and starts slowly rolling forward, and a figure emerges from the darkness. A man in shorts is standing in the middle of the road, watching us drive towards him. This is a dirt road in the middle of nowhere at 2 in the morning on a very cold fall night, and this man is standing in the road wearing nothing but shorts. Not even shoes on. Just shorts. What the duck is he doing? The driver says this as he pushes on the brakes and stops the car. We all stared for a moment at this man, just staring at us. His eyes were glowing, like a deer's eyes do in the headlights. I've never seen a person's eyes glow like that before. We all start freaking out, and then the driver says, "Duck this," and starts driving forward. Fast. The man just keeps staring at us until we get about 10 feet away, and then he just calmly walks to the side of the road and vanishes. It was early spring 2016. I had just turned 24 years old. My friend and I just reached our main spot to camp, Black Canyon Rim Campgrounds, just outside of Payson, Arizona. We'd usually travel out here 2 or 3 times each year. It has some incredible views and is only a couple hours away from the city. For the most part, this area was pretty secluded. A privately owned convenience store rested a few miles away, with a small town 20 miles before that. The entrance was on a dirt road, directly off the highway, with a campground sign at the start of the road, marking local wildlife, any fire hazards, and general news relevant to camping folk. The path is mostly linear, with maybe one fork spanning several miles. We once traveled down the dirt road to see how far it would take us. One of the paths would take you to another highway entrance, with a ranger's tower halfway there. The other path led to a dead end. An abandoned cabin can be found on this path a few miles in, mostly hidden off in the distance behind some larger foliage. The snow had mostly cleared up at this point, leaving crisp air, a slight chill, and fauna becoming active again. We'd usually spot some wild horses, several deer, and tons of little critters whenever we'd come out this way. It really was the perfect time of year for a relaxing trip to get away from the city for a few days. We got in around 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. It was late for us, as we'd usually try to make it out there by noon at the latest. This trip was pretty spontaneous. We both had work during the coming weekend, and we decided to just go for it. The sun was setting fast, and we still hadn't picked our spot to camp. There were maybe 2 other groups, both families, parked somewhat close to the entrance, only a few hundred yards away from the highway. This time around, we just wanted to get away from humans for a while. Customer service jobs will do that to you. We drove down the dirt road, past our usual spot, and finally picked the perfect area. A small clearing, just hanging off the edge of a hill. The whole valley could be seen from this area, with a beautiful sunset. This would have been our main spot from then on, if the next night's incident never happened. We agreed to get a campfire going and would just avoid building a tent this trip. We didn't have much time to do so anyway, and her car wasn't that uncomfortable. I'd sleep in the back seat, and she'd take the passenger seat. With the windows slightly ajar, we'd have a few blankets for each of us, and we'd fall into that unrivaled slumber. The next day went fairly uneventful. We just decompressed. I had this strange feeling throughout the day, though, like we were being watched. There was a crunching of leaves just out of sight every few hours, but I figured it was just the local wildlife doing their thing. My friend didn't notice anything unusual, so I didn't dwell on it. The night came, and the feeling still hadn't gone away. My friend must have felt something she didn't vocalize, though. She took some of her sleeping pills. She didn't usually need to take them on our camping trips. The nature's ambience was enough to put anyone to sleep, I thought. It was nearing 1 a.m. My friend dozed off in the passenger's seat while I attempted to wind down in the back. I leaned against the side window, behind the passenger seat, legs outstretched to the car's back door. The window opposite me was rolled down slightly, with a cold breeze flowing in. I had been on my phone, scrolling through Facebook or whatever, when I heard something outside. A few crunches of the fallen leaves. Several paces outside the car I whispered to my friend, "Did you hear that?" But she was already out. I put my phone down and listened intently for a minute or two. Nothing. It must have been a small animal, curious about the camp. I went back to my phone, scrolling through social media. About 10 minutes had passed when I heard it again. Crunch. Right outside the door. I lowered the phone. My eyes took a moment to adjust from the light of the phone into the deep darkness of the woods. As I turned the phone away from me, the backlight illuminated the window above my feet. To this day, I can't get the image out of my head. 2 dirty, scabbed hands held onto the window. The fingers wrapped inside the car. The nails were long, unkempt, and dark. Behind the window, a silhouette of a face was pressed up against it. The breath would create condensation every few seconds. All I could make out were the reflections of those empty, black eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It felt like eternity, the staring contest between me and this thing. Thoughts were repeating incessantly in my head. Why haven't they run away when they saw I noticed them? What were they planning? Is this the face of death? After probably 10 seconds of not doing anything, the hand slowly unclenched the window and receded into the darkness. The condensation on the window dispersed. Another couple seconds passed before I heard the dreaded crunch, 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 crunch melodically fading into the distance. I still just sat there. What in the duck just happened? Why didn't I do anything? Why am I still not doing anything? With that thought, my body shot into adrenaline. I pounded on my friend's seat, waking her up from her slumber into dizzy confusion. I unlatched and kicked open the back door and took a moment to scan the area. Whoever they were, whatever it was gone. I scrambled to pick up any important camping supplies we left outside and just crammed everything into the back seat and trunk, periodically looking over my shoulder and listening for those footsteps. I slammed the back door shut, and there they were, a grim reminder of the horror that just happened. 2 handprints were imprinted on the window. I quickly wiped them off the window in a panic, a reaction to erase the event, I guess. I jumped into the front seat, started the car, and floored it out of there. My friend, finally coming to, asked me what the hell I was doing. "We gotta go." I said, "There's someone out there." I didn't see whatever or whoever it was while fleeing the scene. Speeding down the dirt road, my friend insisted I slow down, and I eventually did. We reached the highway, and I proceeded to drive 20 or so miles before we reached a Denny's, where my friend asked for us to stop to eat and explain everything. The nightmares subsided a few months later. My embarrassment continues to this day because of the state of shock I was in at the time. Everybody says you either have a fight or flight instinct, and I'm confused about whether I have either. I mean, I just sat there and did nothing. I frequently tend to ask myself, who was out there? Another camper messing with us? A resident of the abandoned cabin down the dirt road? Or maybe something more paranormal residing in the forest, watching lone, vulnerable campers as they drift off to dreamland. We'd still go camping there in the years ahead, but never too far from the highway. Whatever it was, I hope that's the last I've seen of it. One weekend night in Idaho, my boyfriend at the time and I went to a show in Boise. It was one of my first times driving to Boise, so on our way home late at night, we got lost. We had no idea where we were, so I decided to try to turn around and backtrack. We were at a 4-way stoplight and turned left into this area that looked like a good spot, but it brought us into this weird gated community with nowhere to turn around, so I kept driving, thinking I'd just come right out the other side of the community. The whole thing was really strange and just got stranger and stranger as we drove straight through. The first thing we noticed right away was there were literally no lights on anywhere. Not one house light or street light, it was pitch dark aside from my headlights. The trees kept getting thicker until we couldn't even see the sky. It was dead silent and still. It wasn't even that late yet. Like 12 or 1 a.m. As we keep going, I noticed something up ahead. It was a large body on the left side, almost in the middle of this small road. As we get closer and closer to this body, I realize what it is. It's some type of animal standing over another body on the ground, and we start kind of freaking out because we have to drive right by this scene to get through. We couldn't turn around because the road was so small, so knowing that's my only option, I continue, even slower this time. We told ourselves, oh, it's just Mother Nature, you know. Circle of life. We're okay. I continue to drive towards it, and I start shaking because, as we get near it, we can see that it is actually huge, with very tall legs. We are freaking out, and I'm trying to be brave as the driver. We have our lives in our hands, I think to myself. So I still continue towards this very, very large animal. As we get closer, I can still picture what happened next. That image will never leave my mind. The animal was even bigger than we thought, way bigger than a man and taller than a car. And I was staring, I couldn't look away, and my eyes were wide as hell because they couldn't even believe what they saw next. Right as I am next to it, it lifts its head up from this other body, and I swear to you, there is so much thick liquid, I'm pretty sure it was blood, but it was so dark it looked like dark thick liquid, dripping off his face and mouth. And it smiles at me, with all his bloody sharp teeth. He was grinning, and his eyes were ducking glowing bright white, and like I said, there were no lights anywhere, my headlights were not even the reason for his eyes reflecting like that. I don't even remember how we got home, I don't remember much after that, but I know it was one of the wildest things I've ever seen. And we got home safely, but I still have nightmares about that thing. So I used to live near an infamous road. It's a thin road with no street lines, has only a few houses at the end, and is lined with thick woods. There were no street lights. We heard stories like ghosts being spotted in the woods, weird beasts, creepy vibes, and a penny thrown off a small bridge coming back to you. My boyfriend and I decided to drive down it one night in his car. It was a small stick-shift car. The road had several pull-offs where you could park and sit. We pulled off at the first one and took some footage of the woods. Nothing happened. So we continued driving to the next pull-off. We parked and shut off the car. We heard some rustling, but we both assumed it was an animal moving away from the sound of the car parking. We sat for a few seconds in the dark woods. We heard something hit the car, like a rock or something. We then heard several pounds on the truck and roof. At this point, we decided to drive off. He attempted to start the car, but to no avail. He tried this several times before its eventual start. He then put it in gear and stepped on the gas. The car stood still. I was freaking out and told him to stop messing around. He said he wasn't, and then the car, while in first gear and the gas depressed, began to be pulled backwards. Against all logic, the car was fighting to go forward against something that wasn't viewable. The tail lights lit up the forest behind us, and there was nothing there. Out of nowhere, the car miracle jumped forward, and we drove away from the pull-off. Blown away by the experience we just had, we decided to find another pull-off. This was stupid. The one we found was before the bridge, where pennies are thrown. We toddle to the bridge and throw a penny. We hear it hitting the small stream. We look back at the car and swear we see someone walk behind it. So we rush back to the car, and there is no sign of anyone. This was the last straw, and we decided to get off the road ASAP. We get in the car and speed off. As we are driving, something small hits and chips our windshield. It did not sound like a rock. It sounded like a penny. Whatever was on the road either wanted us gone or to never leave. We haven't gone back since. More scary than creepy, but about midnight we were driving back from a skate park and stopped at another new skate park that had just been built to check it out. We pulled up into this weird parking lot, and the only other car was a really shitty car that was super rusted, like with the doors falling off and taped up. Anyway, we get back into the car and get on our way. I'm in shotgun while my friend is driving, and I immediately notice the car turns on and pulls out. As a joke, I said they were following us. Ha, of course, that's exactly what actually starts to happen. It wasn't that creepy until we got outside of the town limits, when they turned off all their lights. Then me and my friend look at each other, and my other friend in the back says something along the lines of bruh, Simon, that's not real, there's no way. They followed us for about 30 minutes and would sometimes cut in front of us and signal for us to pull over, flash fake cop lights in their car, pull in front, wait in the left turn lane until we passed, all with their lights completely off, then follow us again. My friend driving was super serious at this point, and we were all just silently on edge, thinking we were going to get killed and sold for organs or some shit. Finally, after avoiding getting pulled over or hit, we got to a curvy part of the road we knew well. We gunned it super fast, lost them about 6 turns in, then took a back way home. We all kind of just went to bed horrified and couldn't believe that just happened.